Wiring up an electric guitar could be tricky. Today we're going to try and make it a little bit easier. So I've been working on my guitars for years now. I've been enjoying doing modifications to my guitars, and I can't downplay the fact that perhaps one of the most challenging things is getting the electronics right. It's not an easy thing to do, especially if you don't have that kind of skill set under your belt already. It's a little bit challenging, especially for the newbies that are trying to wire up a guitar for the very first time. So in today's video, I want to take you through a step-by-step process on how I wire up this Telecaster guitar, and hopefully you can come away from this video with a few extra tips under your belt and maybe a little bit more confidence to tackle it yourself. Now, if you've been following my channel, you probably already know that I've recorded a series of these how-to videos for you. And basically, we're going step by step through the process of building a Partcaster Telecaster. I highly recommend you watch those videos first before watching this one, just so that you can see the entire process unfold before your eyes. And the goal of these videos is to end up with a fully built, functional, and hopefully great sounding Telecaster at the end of all this, which I'll present to you as a full guitar review and playthrough. So without further ado, let's jump to my messy workbench and take a look at how to wire up a Telecaster. This Telecaster is still in stages of being put together. As you can see, nothing is actually screwed down yet, because today we're going to be looking at wiring up the control cavity and the pickups. Now, the pickups that are in this bridge are in there temporarily. Same for the pickups in the pickguard here. I'm going to be replacing those with a set of fuzzy duck pickups that incidentally come from the same place where we got the body and the neck for this guitar build, and that is Guitar Anatomy. So a big shout out to them. They have some really nice parts, and if you're looking for anything for an upcoming build, I highly recommend you check them out. Go to their website and see what they have to offer. These fuzzy duck pickups are boutique style handmade pickups, but at a very affordable price. The set costs only about 45 pounds, because Guitar Anatomy is over in Europe, and they claim to be hand-built, handmade, and designed to produce the sound of a vintage 50s Telecaster. So I'm hoping that will be the case, because you know, I love that sound. These pickups come complete with Alnico 5 poles, and you know, the idea is to replicate the vintage punchy sound of a 1948 Broadcaster. So if, you know, that turns out to be true, I think this guitar build is going to be pretty sweet, and we'll be able to kick the tires in a video where I can showcase these pickups in all their glory. So before we can do that, we have to start off with the wiring process. So these will be put aside for now, and I'm going to start off the process by removing the pickups that we already have in the build. This wire cavity here is already partially wired, so I'm going to actually step backwards when I actually remove everything from the guitar, and we'll be reinstalling the new pickups, and I'll show you how we're going to go about wiring. So that includes the bridge, the neck, the control cavity, and the output jack. So here's a little tip. If you're going to be working on your wiring, you can just turn over the control plate here and put it into the route so that it'll stay in place, and it's easier to work on the wiring here, so you don't have to mess about with it, especially if you don't have help and you're working on it by yourself. It's a lot easier. So we're going to start off by clipping off the wires that we already have here. And one of the tips I want to share with you guys is, instead of just desoldering the wires, what you could do to make things easier is just clip off the wire and leave a little bit of the colored shielding on the wire, and that could be a visual reminder of where everything needs to go once you swap the pickups and are ready to wire the new ones. Because often if you just desolder everything, you're going to forget where everything goes, and that is a very helpful tool that I learned a long time ago, and it's a tip that I've used ever since. So at this stage in the game, all you're going to really need is a little pair of clippers, and we're going to start off by just clipping off the wires. And we'll also clip off the black ground wires here as well. Typically those go to the back of one of the pots. And in this case, I'll actually leave the wire that's going to the output jack. This is already soldered in place. I'll leave that for the time being. You should be able to pull out the bridge pickup at this point, and you should also be able to pull out the pickguard. This wire is a ground wire that I soldered inside of the cavity here along the shielding. This is going to be used as a ground, and it's going to go back to the back of the pot here, just to ensure everything is connected and will work nicely as a shielded guitar. As you can see, I also put some shielding on the back of the pickguard here, on the back of the cavity here for the neck pickup, so the screws will make contact, and I put a strip that goes all the way down here. And this section of shielding will actually touch the little piece of shielding that we have right over here, and that will end up on a screw as well when we actually make a hole for the cavity for the shielding cover here. That's going to touch. We have the shielding that's going to go on the back of the bridge here, and everything is connected. So we have continuity between all of the different cavities. Okay, so the next step, we'll just take the body out of the way here. Okay, so at this stage of the game, we're just going to remove these screws so that we can take off the pickup here. You want to be careful not to accidentally damage the connectors. If you have a drill, that goes way faster than obviously doing it by hand like I'm doing here. But you can make do with whatever tools you have. So these pickups sound good to me, but I wanted to have an opportunity to try out the Fuzzy Duck pickups from Guitar Anatomy, and that's why I'm taking these out for the time being. I'll keep these for another build. They'll surely be reused and recycled in another guitar build eventually. Nothing goes to waste. If it sounds good and it works, we definitely want to use it. So Telecaster pickups tend to have 3 screws on the bridge plate here, and this is used to adjust the positioning of the pickup when it's in the body, and I'll show you how we adjust that eventually as part of the setup process for this build. These have springs on them on the back. Sometimes they use, older style setups might use a rubber tubing instead of springs. That works too. You can see this pickup has plastic shielding in a brass plate. The one that we're going to be replacing it with, this one, also has a brass plate here, but the wires are actually made out of braided material, like the vintage ones were. Alright, can't wait to try these out. So once we have the pickup out of the bridge, I'm going to reuse these screws. Hopefully they'll fit in. Sometimes, depending on where you get the pickups from, the screws may not fit the holes. Hopefully these do. It will save us a little bit of trouble. By the way, these little wires that you have here are very important, because that's basically what's wrapping around the slugs. If those break, you're going to have a pickup that does not work. So you want to be super careful and try not to touch those, or accidentally hit them with the screwdriver or anything when you're doing this. So once the pickups are aligned, and it's dummy proof, because you have them in the right direction when they all fit, because they're staggered, so you can't really mess them up. And at this point, I don't put them in too deep. I'll just basically place them temporarily, like so. However, you do want them. You want them to clear the top a little bit more, so they don't cause problems when you're trying to align the bridge later. This is just eyeballing it at this point. Eventually, we're gonna set it up properly. Okay. Okay, so that's going to hold. That's not going to fall out or anything. And now we have the wires. Now these wires are pretty long. We may trim them depending on how long of a run we need to get to the other side. But before that, I'm going to install the pickup that goes inside of the neck cavity. So we'll put this aside. And we're going to take this one out. This one had a little bit of foam underneath to use as a spacer. I removed that. The new ones are much cleaner. You can see here by comparison, very similar, except these ones had a foam spacer in the back of it to help push it up, and this one doesn't. This one's much cleaner, and as you can see, it's got the braided wire as opposed to the plastic wire. Okay, so we're going to take out the existing one and put in the new one right now. Same process, very simple and actually a little bit boring. All we really have to do is just take out the screws. There's a lot of stages in guitar building that give you a lot of time to think, like taking screws out, taking things apart. We have the rubber tubing as opposed to the springs. Now I could take these out. I do have springs, but I'm just going to reuse these. They work fine. It's more of the vintage way of doing things. Not that it makes a difference in terms of sound or anything like that, but we'll just go with that. So I'm going to just put the pickup here, place it over the screws. Hopefully everything works and the screws are not too big. Now also, sometimes when you're dealing with new pickups that have been wax potted, you will have a little bit of wax in the hole. So I'll use a little screw and just clear that out. And so in this case, I just finally just use the same screw, just widen the hole a little bit, and made do with that. So sometimes you do have to use some ingenuity and just MacGyver it to make things fit. But in this case now, we're ready to put the screws back on the plate here and slip in one of these rubber tubes. And the cool thing about these rubber tubes is that they hold everything in place, so nothing falls out, as opposed to the springs that sometimes are a little bit more finicky and tend to fall out when you're trying to put things in place, right? So we're going to put the other one in here. And we're ready to place the pickup on there. Now when you put the pickup on the screws, the wires should be facing the bottom of the pickguard. You don't want to put it the other way around. Just place it by eye, then hold it in place, flip over the pick guard and just use a screwdriver to screw things in place. It's a little bit finicky, especially if you're trying to videotape things while you're doing this. If you see that the pickup is not holding properly, you may need a little bit of a wider or longer rubber tube, but in this case it should be just fine. It's always a good idea to keep some of the parts from previous builds, because you never know when you're going to be looking for that missing screw that you thought you had, you know, or a spring or something, and it's very difficult and costly to run out and try and find a one screw that's going to work. So I usually keep a whole bunch of parts in, you know, different containers like this, so that I could be sure to have what I need. Alright, so next we'll have to fish the wires through the holes to bring them all to the control cavity route here. So there's no real easy way of doing that. You just have to be patient. What I like to do is I like to take the wires and just wrap them a little bit like this, and then tape up the ends so that they don't get snagged as easily. So I'll just tape up this with a little bit of, you can either tape them or you can actually just braid the tips too. That works. Just like that. And then fish them through. If you're lucky, you'll get them through without them snagging anywhere. If you're going to be putting anything on your guitar, it's a good idea to put something down so you don't scratch anything. So we're lucky enough that the wires don't have very far to go, so we can actually pull them through quite easily. So I'll place these back in the cavity, and we have both of the wires. So this is pretty straightforward. We have all the wires coming through. You want to take note of the color so you remember which one is the bridge and which one is ultimately the neck pickup. We're going to do the same thing for this. I'm just going to braid them as we did. And also I noticed that when you do braid the wire like this, it actually reduces hum. I don't know why, but it does. So I do this all the time when I can. Okay. Same process. It may not be as easy. You can also use a guitar wire. Fish it through the hole if you have an extra one lying around, and then use that as a fish. But in this case, the wires go in nice and easy. No issues. So here we have the neck pickup here, the bridge pickup here, and we're ready to tin the wires before we actually solder them back onto the plate. So let's get the soldering iron. Let's get that ready. It's very important that you tin the wires properly before you do anything else. So we're going to make sure all of the wires that we're going to be working with here are properly tinned. Now when people are doing any kind of work on the electronics, you know, you can get soldering irons with various power ratings, 40, 60, 20 watts. For this kind of work, I wouldn't go higher than 40 watts. You have to be careful. The hotter the iron, the quicker the solder is going to melt, and the quicker you might actually damage the pots or the you know the caps that you're using, or whatever, the resistors. You want to make sure that you don't keep the heat on the part longer than it needs to be. So we're going to plug this in and we're going to heat it up. Also to note, you want to make sure the tip is clean. So this to me is dirty. When it heats up, I'm going to just clean it off. If it's nice and shiny, it actually transfers the heat way better, and you get a nice proper solder joint. You don't end up with a cold solder joint. So one of the good things about using the braided wire is that you can just push it back and expose more wire as you need it. Whereas these type of wires need to be removed. So you would have to have the right tool. You would need something like this, a little wire stripper, to be able to strip off the wire, like so. While these can just be pushed back a little bit. Now when you're doing this kind of work, you want to make sure you have good quality solder with, sometimes they have a resin core. You don't want to use the thick plumber solder. You need the right one, so make sure it looks something like this. Get the best quality you can get. It'll make your life a lot easier. So a little tip I like to use in order to keep the wires braided like so is to slip on a little piece of shrink tubing. You can actually cut it in half. You don't need this much. And just slip it over like so. And later on we'll just heat it up in place so that the wire won't, the braid won't come apart. It keeps things nice and neat. So the soldering iron is nice and hot at this point, so we're going to just flip things over and we're going to disconnect the old connection and put in the new one. But we haven't actually tinned the wire yet. So the first thing we're going to do is tin the wire. Whenever you're dealing with any kind of solder, you want to make sure you protect your surface. Doesn't take very long. It doesn't seem like much, but it makes a pretty big difference when everything is tinned properly. I'll use the heat gun to just shrink the shrink wrap here. Just to hold everything in place. We'll do the same with the other wires. So do you guys remember where the wires need to go? Probably not, right? You probably forgot already. This is why I suggested we leave the little tip so that we can remember what goes where. This wire will go there. The white wire will go there across the last two lugs and the first two lugs. And the ground wire here will go on the back of this pot. The two black wires will also go on the back of that pot. Pretty straightforward, but sometimes you might forget. Now if the solder that you have on the connector seems to be cold and not very nice, you can take the opportunity to reflow it or to apply a little bit new solder on there. We'll remove this side here. So once the wires are in place, you want to give them a little tug, make sure everything's solid. And now the black wires are our ground wires, and those are going to go to the back of this pot here. And as you can probably already see, this pot is a little bit messy. So we're going to reflow what we have going on here, and we're going to put the new black ground wires to this point here. Alright, at this point we have all of the wiring done. So this is the bridge, this is the neck, these are the ground wires. Just checking to make sure everything is solid. This is going to the output jack. Nothing too fancy there. It's basically just two little connectors going to the output jack there. And you can basically put all the wiring back in the cavity at this point. Try and keep it neat. As neat as you can. And make sure nothing is in the way of the switch. In this particular case it would be quite difficult because the switch is in its own little box, but in some cases the switch is exposed. And we're going to just do a quick test right now to make sure everything is working the way it should. And the easiest way to do that is just to plug in the guitar with a lead into an amplifier, and we're going to do the touch test. I highly recommend you do this before you start screwing everything down, because there's nothing worse than having everything in place and then having to take the guitar apart again. So we're just going to plug in a little guitar lead here, as you can see right over here. We're going to turn up the amplifier just to make sure we have sound. And then all you need is a little screwdriver. Make sure it's a metallic screwdriver. And we're going to put the switch on the bridge position. We're going to turn up the volume. Make sure everything's turned up nice and loud. And you're going to just tap the bridge pickup. And you should hear a nice clear sound. You can test the volume by just turning it down. Shouldn't hear anything. And we can also test the tone. Turning it down should be a little bit darker and a little bit more muddy. Not as you lose the highs. That seems to be working properly. Put it in the middle position. We should be able to hear both pickups now. Okay, as we can see, the neck pickup is a lot lower in terms of the sound, which is quite normal for certain types of pickups. We're going to put it in the neck position now. We hear that nice and clear. The volume works. The tone works. So we're in business. Basically, both of the pickups are installed. Everything seems to be working nicely. The most important thing is that you don't hear any weird buzzing sounds or anything like that. At this point, if you hear anything like that, you might have an issue with the way things were wired up. Of course, if you don't hear anything, that's even worse, because then you probably wired something incorrectly. But if you take the process step by step like I showed you, you should be in business, and it should be quite straightforward. If everything works out properly, then you can disconnect your lead. You can start drilling the holes for certain things, including the bridge and the control plate and all of that. But at this stage, what I like to do is make sure the bridge is in the proper position, and then install the neck before I finalize the position of the pickguard and the control cavity. Why is that? Well, because this could move, and depending on the position of your neck, you want everything to align up properly. And there's nothing uglier than a pickguard that's a little bit crooked. And of course, the pickguard will also determine the positioning of the control plate. So I recommend leaving these two till the end. The next step will be screwing down the bridge so that we can then install the neck, and we leave the cavity, control cavity cover, and the pick guard last, because I like to adjust the positioning of these once the neck is in place, just to make sure everything's aligned nicely and it's not crooked. There's nothing uglier than a crooked, pick guard and control plate here. Just to keep things clean and neat, I'm going to make the holes for the output jack here so that we don't accidentally rip off the wire while we're working on other things. So I'm just going to put this in. You want to make sure that the wire is not going to be in the way, and you want to align the holes so that they're vertical with the body. At this point, I'll use my trusty bit here to make sure that everything is centered, and we're going to make 2 small pilot holes. Once those pilot holes are drilled, we can put in the screws. These can sometimes be tricky because you are putting in the screws at an angle, so I like to put in both screws a short distance in, and then do the rest of the tightening a little bit on each side to make sure that everything's going in the way it should. If you take your time, everything should be nice and flush. Alright, so at this point we've enlarged the holes for the bridge. We've screwed down the screws. We've applied wax before putting in the screws. I've done them by hand so that we can feel how much pressure we're putting down. If you're using a drill, sometimes you can go a little bit too aggressively and you can snap off the head of the screw, which is not going to be good. Highly recommend that you use a little bit of wax or soap or something on your screw to make sure it goes in nice and easy, and that your bridge is nice and snug. Now what I use here for wax is what I already have on hand, which happens to be this Monty's Guitars Instrument Food, which is basically a wax. It's a clear wax. You can also use beeswax, you can use a candle, you can use soap, whatever you have on hand, but definitely helping the screws go in by lubricating them a little bit is definitely a good idea, because you don't want to snap off, the head off of the screw by over tightening it, because you're forcing it. Now at this point you could make the hole for the control plate, and you can make the holes for the pick guard, but I like to leave that till after I have the neck in place, because if you put the neck on first, then you can make sure that everything is aligned. And if you have a little bit of OCD like I do, there's nothing worse than having the pick guard slightly tilted to one side or another. And of course the control cavity is also dependent on the location of the pick guard, because you want to have it nicely snug in place, evenly distanced. So the next step will be installing the neck. So let's take the neck, and I'll show you how I locate the holes for the neck, and we screw that in. So I really hope you're getting something of value out of these how-to videos that we're producing in this series. If you enjoy this kind of content, please give us a thumbs up and maybe consider subscribing to the channel. This is why we produce this content. It's for you. At the same time, we want to invite you guys over to our live Sunday show, which happens right here on Addicted to Gear, 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time every Sunday morning, and we talk gear, guitars, and shop, and we answer all your questions live and uncensored. So don't miss it right here this Sunday, 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. See you then.